The first thing Griffin Hart felt when he woke up was not the couch beneath him, but an arm around his waist, like someone had decided, without permission, that he was worth holding on to. His eyes snapped open in the dim light of early morning, heart stumbling as he realized he wasn't alone, wasn't even on his side of the world anymore, because he was curled against Callum Pierce like it was the most natural place he could have landed in his sleep. The memory hit second. He had come over last night just to escape a broken lock, a dead phone, and a long day that had left him too tired to think straight, and Callum had offered the couch without hesitation, no questions asked, just that calm look in his eyes, like Griffin wasn't an inconvenience, just someone temporarily out of place. Now Griffin could feel the steady rise and fall of Callum's breathing behind him, warm and controlled, like the man had stayed awake long enough to make sure Griffin didn't move off the couch, like he had decided Griffin sleeping alone wasn't acceptable for reasons Griffin didn't understand yet. He tried to shift carefully, but Callum's grip tightened slightly, not restraining, not forceful, just instinctive, like even in sleep he was afraid of losing something he had been silently protecting. Griffin froze, breath caught in his throat, because that wasn't normal neighbor behavior, not even close. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft gray light leaking through blinds, but everything about the moment felt louder than it should have been, like the silence itself was pressing for answers. Griffin slowly turned his head just enough to see Callum's face in profile, calm, unreadable even in sleep, a faint shadow under his eyes like he hadn't really rested at all. That detail landed strangely in Griffin's chest, something unspoken tightening there before he could name it. Callum's hand rested at Griffin's side, not gripping now, just there, as if letting go required more effort than holding on. Griffin's mind raced backward through the night, trying to piece together what he had missed, the way Callum had insisted on setting up the couch himself, adjusting the blanket twice like he wasn't satisfied with anything less than perfect, the way he had paused at the hallway light, as if listening for something outside the apartment, before finally sitting down across from Griffin instead of going to his own room. Griffin had thought it was just politeness. Now it felt like something else entirely. He carefully shifted again, and this time Callum's eyes opened immediately, like he hadn't been fully asleep at all. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet alertness that softened the moment he realized Griffin was awake. For a second, neither of them spoke. Callum's hand loosened but didn't fully leave, hovering as if unsure whether distance was safe. "You fell asleep," Callum said finally, voice low and steady, like he was confirming something he had already accepted hours ago. Griffin swallowed, glancing down at the position they were in, the closeness that made no logical sense for two men who barely knew each other beyond hallway nods and borrowed packages. "Yeah," Griffin replied, voice rough with sleep and confusion. "I didn't mean to end up like this." Callum's gaze flicked briefly to Griffin's face, then away again, like holding eye contact for too long might reveal something he wasn't ready to expose. "You didn't move much," he said, almost absently, almost like that mattered more than anything else. Griffin pushed himself up slightly on one elbow, and that's when he noticed it. A faint mark on Callum's wrist, like pressure from holding something too tightly for too long, or maybe from keeping his arm in the same position through the night. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there, real enough to make Griffin pause. "Did you even sleep?" Griffin asked before he could stop himself. The question landed differently than he expected. Callum didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes shifted toward the window, where morning light was finally beginning to sharpen the edges of the room. When he spoke, it wasn't quite an answer. "I didn't want you waking up alone in a place you weren't used to." Something in Griffin's chest tightened at that, uninvited and confusing. It wasn't romantic, not fully not. Clearly, but it was protective in a way that didn't fit the simple story of neighbors and couches and chance timing. Griffin sat up fully now, the space between them finally widening, and Callum slowly withdrew his arm, though his fingers lingered for half a second longer than necessary before falling back to his side. That pause felt like a decision he didn't want to make. Griffin was about to speak again when Callum stood and walked toward the kitchen without explanation, like creating distance was easier than explaining closeness. But as he passed the counter, Griffin saw something that made his thoughts stall completely. A folded piece of paper sitting under a glass of water, Callum's handwriting visible even from where he sat. 2 words repeated twice, then scratched out, "Stay close." And underneath it, a second line, partially torn as if it had been hidden in a rush. "Not again." Griffin stared at it, the meaning unclear but heavy enough to shift the entire feeling of the morning. Callum had said nothing else about it when he returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting one down near Griffin like it was the most normal thing in the world. But Griffin could no longer ignore the fact that Callum Pierce hadn't just let him sleep on a couch. He had stayed awake to make sure nothing pulled him away. And whatever again meant, it wasn't about the couch at all. Griffin sat still for a moment longer than he intended, fingers wrapped around the warm cup of coffee Callum had placed in front of him. But his attention was not on the drink. It was on the folded paper under the glass of water across the counter, like it had weight far beyond its size. Callum moved around the kitchen quietly, each motion controlled and deliberate, as if normal routine could erase what had just been exposed between them. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was guarded, like both of them understood something had shifted and neither knew how to name it without breaking it further. Griffin finally stood and walked to the counter, picking up the paper without asking permission. Callum did not stop him, but his hand paused mid-motion when Griffin unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as before, but clearer now in the morning light, and the words felt heavier than ink. "Stay close" repeated twice, then crossed out. "Not again" written underneath like a warning that had already failed once before. Griffin glanced up, watching Callum's expression tighten almost imperceptibly before he turned back to the stove. "What does 'not again' mean?" Griffin asked quietly. Callum did not answer immediately. The sound of a kettle clicking off filled the space instead, sharp and final. "It means I do not repeat mistakes," Callum said at last, voice calm but distant, like he was placing distance between himself and the question. Griffin did not accept that, not because it was unreasonable, but because it felt incomplete, like a door half closed on purpose. Before he could press further, a sharp buzz echoed through the apartment. The front intercom lit up. Callum froze instantly, and the change was immediate, subtle but absolute. His shoulders shifted, his eyes sharpened, and the quiet domestic rhythm of the kitchen vanished like it had never existed. Griffin noticed it before the sound even stopped. "Do not answer that," Callum said, already moving toward the hallway. The tone was not loud, but it was firm in a way that carried experience, not preference. Griffin stayed where he was, confused but alert as Callum reached the door panel and looked at the screen. The camera feed showed nothing clearly, just a blurred silhouette outside the building entrance. Callum did not open the door. Instead, he stepped slightly in front of Griffin without looking back, placing himself between him and the hallway as if it were instinct. Another buzz came, longer this time. Griffin could hear footsteps faintly through the speaker, then silence. Callum waited exactly 3 seconds before cutting the intercom off completely. The apartment returned to quiet, but it was no longer soft. It was tense. Griffin stepped forward slightly. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. Callum shook his head once, but it was not convincing. "No," he said, too fast. Then after a pause, "Stay inside today." Griffin frowned. "I have work." Callum finally turned to face him fully, and there was something in his expression that Griffin had not seen before, not even the night before when they were sleeping inches apart. It was restraint, but not emotional restraint. It was the kind that came from holding back action. "Take the day off," Callum said. It was not a request. Griffin opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw Callum's hand flex slightly at his side, like he was resisting the urge to do something he would not explain. Instead of continuing the argument, Griffin looked away, frustration mixing with curiosity. He walked back toward the living room, trying to make sense of the shift. That was when he noticed something he had missed earlier. Near the couch, partially hidden under the edge of a throw blanket, was a small stack of printed papers clipped together. Griffin picked them up without thinking. The top page showed a grainy image, security camera quality, dim lighting. It took him a second to understand what he was seeing. It was the same couch. His own body curled on it, asleep. The timestamp in the corner showed the previous night before Callum had ever offered the couch. Griffin felt his throat tighten slightly. He turned the page. Another image. This one clearer. Callum standing over him. Not sitting, not relaxed, but watching. Not touching. Just watching like he was confirming something. The third image was worse in its quietness. Callum with a phone in his hand, screen glowing, a contact name partially visible at the edge of the frame. One word stood out before Griffin could process anything else. Hospital. Griffin's breath slowed. Behind him, Callum's voice came softer than before. Where did you find those? Griffin did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the image, on Callum's posture, on the way he looked like someone trying not to repeat something he could not fully escape. The phrase from the note came back with full weight now. Not again. Griffin finally turned slightly, still holding the papers. You have been watching me, he said quietly. Callum did not deny it. He just stood there, as if waiting for the moment Griffin would decide whether that was protection or something else entirely. And in the silence that followed, Griffin noticed Callum's hand slowly closing around something in his pocket, like he was preparing for a choice he had already made once before and was not sure he could afford to make again. Griffin did not realize he was holding his breath until Callum stepped forward and gently took the printed pages from his hands, not ripping them away, not hiding them, but carefully folding them back as if even the truth inside them could be damaged if handled too fast. The silence between them stretched longer this time, heavier than before, because something irreversible had shifted in the way Griffin looked at him. Not confusion anymore, but recognition mixed with suspicion. Callum placed the papers on the table and stayed close enough that Griffin could not pretend this was just a conversation anymore. You were outside my place before last night, Griffin said slowly, watching Callum's face for cracks. Callum did not deny it. That alone was an answer. Instead, he exhaled once, controlled and quiet, like he had been holding that breath for a long time. Yes, Callum said. Griffin's jaw tightened. Why? Callum's eyes moved briefly toward the window, toward the street below, as if measuring distance before speaking. Because you have been there before, he said. The words landed wrong at first, like they belonged in another conversation, another life. Griffin frowned. I moved in 3 months ago. Callum shook his head slightly. Not this time. That single phrase changed the temperature of the room. Griffin stepped back half a step, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as if space could help him think more clearly. You are not making sense, Griffin said. Callum did not react defensively. He simply reached for something on the counter instead, a small key card Griffin had not noticed before. It was worn at the edges, like it had been used far more often than a new tenant should ever need. Callum placed it on the table beside the papers. This was issued to you last year, Callum said. Griffin stared at it, then at Callum, then back at the card. I have never seen that before, Griffin said immediately. Callum's gaze did not waver. That is what you said before, he replied quietly. A silence followed that felt different from all the others. This one carried weight, not tension. Griffin picked up the card slowly. His name was printed on it. His photo was there, slightly older than he remembered taking any official ID. The date stamp was not current. It was almost exactly 1 year ago. Griffin's throat tightened. This is not possible, he said, more to himself than to Callum. Callum stepped closer again, careful not to overwhelm, but not leaving distance either. You were brought here before, he said. You stayed for 2 days. Then you left without explanation. Griffin shook his head once, sharply. I would remember that. Callum's expression softened in a way that did not feel like comfort. It felt like resignation. You did not remember the last time either, he said. The words pressed into something deeper now, something Griffin could not easily dismiss as misunderstanding. He looked at Callum again, really looked this time, noticing the subtle exhaustion behind his eyes, the way his posture carried restraint like it had been practiced for a long time, not just days. Why are you watching me? Griffin asked again, but this time the question was weaker. Callum did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly and opened a drawer near the counter. Inside was a second folder, thicker than the first, edges worn from repeated handling. He placed it on the table, but did not open it. Because you always end up alone when I do not, Callum said finally. Griffin hesitated. That was not an explanation. It was a pattern, a claim based on memory that Griffin did not have access to. Before he could respond, a sudden vibration cut through the silence. Callum's phone lit up on the counter. One message appeared on screen before he turned it face down, too late for Griffin not to see it. Subject: relocation protocol in effect. Confirm status of heart. Griffin's eyes locked onto the words. Subject. Not name. Not neighbor. Callum moved immediately, taking the phone and stepping away as if distance could erase what had already been seen. But Griffin was already moving too, not toward the door, but toward the folder. Callum noticed and reached out, stopping just short of grabbing his wrist. Not forceful, but firm enough to communicate urgency without violence. "Do not open it yet," Callum said, voice lower now. Griffin looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time the protection did not feel like comfort. It felt like containment. "You are not protecting me from something outside," Griffin said quietly. Callum did not respond. And in that silence, Griffin understood the second discovery before even opening the folder. The danger was not coming for him again. It had already happened before. Griffin did not open the folder immediately, but the weight of Callum's silence behind him made it impossible to ignore for long, because it was not avoidance anymore. It was restraint, like Callum was holding something in place that had already started falling apart. Griffin slowly turned the folder over in his hands, feeling the slight stiffness of repeated use, then looked back at Callum. "If I open this," Griffin said quietly, "will it change what I am already seeing?" Callum hesitated just long enough for Griffin to understand the answer without words, then nodded once. That small confirmation carried more honesty than anything Callum had said so far. Griffin opened the folder. Inside were photographs, printed reports, and handwritten notes that did not feel like surveillance in the usual sense, but like documentation of a pattern no one else was supposed to notice. The first page showed Griffin again, not asleep this time, but standing outside the same building from a different night, head slightly turned as if he had been waiting for someone who had not arrived. The timestamp was different from anything Griffin could recall, earlier than his memory of even moving into the neighborhood. His stomach tightened as he turned the page. There were more images, not chaotic, not invasive in the way he expected, but consistent, carefully taken at distance, always showing him at thresholds, doorways, sidewalks, transitions between places. Every version of him looked slightly unfamiliar, like he was always arriving or leaving something he could not fully name. Griffin's breathing slowed as he reached a page that made him stop entirely. It showed Callum standing in the same frame as him, not interacting, but positioned at a distance that suggested familiarity rather than coincidence. Below the image was a short note in Callum's handwriting. "He trusts me faster each cycle." Griffin looked up immediately. "Cycles," he repeated. Callum did not correct him. Instead, he stepped closer but stopped at a careful distance, like he had learned exactly how much space Griffin needed to not feel trapped. "You are not experiencing this for the first time," Callum said softly. Griffin shook his head, but less firmly now. "I do not remember any of this." Callum nodded again, like that was expected. "That is why I stay close." The words should have sounded controlling, but instead they landed like something heavier, like effort sustained over time rather than a single decision. Griffin closed the folder slowly, but did not let go of it. His eyes searched Callum's face for something simpler, something explainable. "Why me?" Griffin asked. It was not accusation. It was exhaustion. Callum looked down for a brief moment, then back up. "Because you always try to save everyone else first," he said. The answer was not scientific, not procedural, but it carried familiarity that Griffin could not easily dismiss. Before Griffin could respond, Callum moved toward the window and checked the street below again, then returned with a quieter urgency. "We should leave for a while," Callum said. Griffin frowned. "Leave where?" "Somewhere you have not been before," Callum replied. That statement should have sounded absurd, but instead it felt like precaution shaped by experience. Griffin hesitated, then surprised himself by nodding slightly. Not because he trusted everything, but because he trusted Callum's reaction more than he trusted the unknown. Within minutes, they were outside the apartment, walking through the early morning streets that now felt unfamiliar in a different way. Callum stayed half a step behind Griffin, not leading, not following, but positioned like a shadow that could move between him and anything approaching. At one point, Griffin noticed Callum adjusting his pace whenever someone passed too close, subtly shifting Griffin away from the edge of the sidewalk without touching him. The gesture should have felt controlling, but instead it felt practiced, almost unconscious. "You do not have to keep doing that," Griffin said after a while. Callum glanced at him. "Doing what?" "Acting like I am going to disappear," Griffin replied. Callum did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked forward again. "You did before," he said. The words should have created fear, but instead they created something stranger, a kind of sadness that did not belong to Griffin alone. They stopped at a small cafe, quiet and nearly empty. Callum let Griffin choose where to sit, and for the first time, he sat beside him instead of across, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, but not quite. It was the smallest adjustment, but it changed everything about the space between them. Griffin noticed Callum's hands resting on the table, steady but not relaxed. There was a faint mark on his wrist again, slightly darker than before, as if pressure had been applied there recently. Griffin hesitated, then gently reached out and turned Callum's wrist upward. Callum did not pull away. The mark was shaped like a band, faint but unmistakable, like something had been removed recently rather than inflicted. Griffin's voice lowered. What happened to this? Callum's expression tightened, not in pain, but in memory. It is not there anymore, he said. That was not an answer. It was avoidance disguised as reassurance. Griffin let go slowly, but instead of pulling back completely, his fingers lingered near Callum's for a second longer than necessary. Callum noticed, but did not comment. Instead, he quietly placed his hand closer, not touching yet, but close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance. Griffin realized, with unexpected clarity, that Callum was not trying to control him. He was trying to keep him anchored. And for the first time, that realization softened something inside Griffin that had been resisting the entire situation. He exhaled slowly, looking down at the table. If I have been here before, Griffin said quietly. Then, what changed? Callum did not answer immediately. Outside the cafe window, a figure passed by too quickly to focus on, but Callum's eyes tracked it for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. When he turned back, his voice was quieter than before. You did, he said. And for the first time, Griffin did not feel like he was being watched. He felt like he was being held in place by something he had not yet lost. But as Callum's phone vibrated once under the table, and he quickly silenced it without looking, Griffin noticed the same word flash briefly on the screen before it turned away. Reset. And this time, Callum did not explain it at all. Griffin had just started to read the word reset in his mind again when Callum's entire posture changed in a way that was almost imperceptible but immediately wrong, like a system running the same program under a different condition. He reached under the table, took his phone, and turned it completely off this time, not just silencing it, but removing its presence entirely from the moment. When he looked up, his eyes were no longer simply alert. They were focused in a way that made Griffin feel as if he had just been moved inside a frame that Callum had already studied before. We need to go, Callum said, voice lower than before. Griffin did not move immediately. Someone just texted you reset, Griffin said. Callum's silence answered faster than his words. That silence was not confusion, it was recognition. He stood, and this time he did not wait for agreement. Griffin followed because the alternative felt worse than not knowing. Outside, the air felt sharper than it had earlier, like the world itself had shifted slightly out of alignment. Callum did not lead him back home. Instead, he guided him through unfamiliar streets that Griffin was certain he had never walked before, yet Callum moved through them like someone following memory rather than direction. After several blocks, they stopped in front of a small building with no signage, only a plain door and a keypad. Callum entered a code without hesitation. The door unlocked instantly. Inside, the space was minimal, sterile in a way that did not match Callum's apartment at all. There were no personal items, only equipment that looked temporary and functional. Griffin stepped in slowly, noticing immediately that Callum had been here before him. Where is this place? Griffin asked. Callum closed the door behind them and finally faced him. A safe interval, he said. Griffin frowned. That is not an answer. Callum nodded once, like he agreed, but could not change it. It is the only place that does not update when the reset happens, he said. Griffin froze at the word again. Reset. The same word from the phone. The same word that now seemed to carry weight Callum had been avoiding naming fully. You keep saying that like I should understand it, Griffin said, his voice tightening. Callum looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, something in his expression cracked just slightly, not into emotion, but into fatigue. He reached into a drawer and placed a small device on the table between them. It looked like a recording unit, older, modified, layered with handwritten labels. Griffin hesitated before picking it up. Callum did not stop him this time. When Griffin pressed play, his own voice came through immediately. Not current. Older. Calmer. If I am hearing this again, then it means it started over, the voice said. Griffin felt his stomach tighten. The recording continued, his voice describing things he had no memory of saying, repeating patterns, explaining Callum in a way that sounded like familiarity rather than introduction. Then it said something that made Griffin step back slightly. Do not trust the version of Callum who does not stay close. Griffin lowered the device slowly. I do not remember recording that, he said. Callum nodded again, like he expected that answer. You never do after a reset, he said quietly. Griffin's chest tightened. Stop saying that like it is normal, Griffin said, frustration breaking through now. Callum finally moved closer, but stopped at a careful distance again, like he was still measuring how much truth Griffin could withstand at once. It is not normal, Callum said. It is necessary. Griffin shook his head. Necessary for what? Callum hesitated, then for the first time since everything began, he looked directly at Griffin without filtering anything. For you to survive long enough to remember me, he said. The words landed harder than anything before them, not because of mystery, but because of repetition implied behind them. Griffin stepped back instinctively. You are saying this has happened before, he said slowly. Callum did not deny it. Many times, he said. The realization did not arrive as a single thought, but as a collapse of everything Griffin thought was stable. The photographs, the key card, the repeated phrase not again, the surveillance, the way Callum never reacted to confusion as if it was new. It all reassembled into something far more unsettling. Griffin felt anger rise first, because it was easier than anything else. So you just decided to follow me through it, he said. Callum did not flinch. I did not decide at the beginning, he said. I continued. That distinction made something worse, not better. Griffin looked away, gripping the edge of the table. How many times, he asked quietly. Callum paused. Enough that I stopped counting resets, he said. Griffin let out a breath that felt unsteady. And every time I do not remember you, he said. Callum nodded. Yes. The simplicity of that answer broke something between them. Griffin turned slightly, distance increasing naturally now, not forced but protective. So what am I to you? Griffin asked, voice quieter. Callum did not answer immediately. When he did, it was not romantic, not dramatic, just raw in its repetition. The only version of you that exists long enough to choose me, he said. The words should have felt intimate. Instead, they felt like a boundary that had been crossed too many times to still be soft. Griffin set the recorder down carefully, as if any sudden movement might fracture the moment further. And if I never choose you, he said. Callum's gaze dropped for the first time. That was the first honest hesitation Griffin had seen. Then I reset again, Callum said. Silence followed, heavier than before. Griffin stepped back toward the door, not leaving yet, but no longer standing in the same place. Callum did not stop him. He only watched, like he already knew where every version of this moment ended. As Griffin reached for the handle, his hand paused. Not because he wanted to stay, but because something inside him refused to accept that this was the entire truth. Behind him, Callum spoke once more, softer now. You always ask me the same question before it happens, he said. Griffin did not turn. What question, he asked. Callum's voice lowered further. Why I am the only one who remembers to stay. And for the first time, Griffin understood that the answer might not be something Callum was giving him, but something he had been trying to prevent him from forgetting. Griffin did not leave the building immediately, but he also did not turn back, standing in the narrow space between the door and Callum's silence like a person suspended between two versions of reality that no longer agreed with each other. Behind him, Callum did not move to stop him. That was what hurt more than anything else, because Griffin had expected control, pursuit, explanation, something that confirmed the intensity he had felt since waking up in Callum's arms. Instead, there was only distance, carefully maintained, like touching him too much now would break something already fragile beyond repair. So what now? Griffin asked without turning around. His voice was steady, but only just. Callum's answer came after a pause that felt like calculation rather than hesitation. Now you leave, Callum said. Griffin finally turned his head slightly. And you stay here and reset again, he said. Callum did not deny it. That silence again, the same kind that had replaced answers too many times already. Griffin nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of something he did not want to understand fully yet. He opened the door and stepped out. The hallway felt colder than before, not because of temperature, but because of absence. The world outside the building looked unchanged, but Griffin did not trust it anymore. Every detail now felt like it could be part of something he had already lived through without remembering. Behind him, the door did not close immediately. Callum remained there, still watching, still not following. That should have felt like abandonment, but instead it felt like restraint, like Callum was holding himself back from repeating something he had already paid for. Griffin walked without direction for several minutes before realizing he was being followed at a distance. He stopped once, turning slightly, and saw Callum across the street, not hiding, but not approaching either. Just present. Griffin's frustration rose immediately. He crossed the street. "You said leave," Griffin said. Callum nodded. "I did." "Then why are you here?" Griffin asked. Callum's gaze flicked briefly to something behind Griffin, then returned. "Because leaving and being gone are not the same thing," he said. Griffin exhaled sharply. "You are making this worse," he said. Callum did not argue. Instead, he stepped forward and, without asking, placed a jacket over Griffin's shoulders. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was practical, but the gesture carried weight because of its timing, because it came from someone who had just been pushed away. Griffin froze slightly at the contact. Callum did not linger. He stepped back immediately, like even that small moment had a cost. Griffin looked down at the jacket. It was his size, familiar in a way that should not have been possible if Callum had only been observing him from a distance. "Where did you get this?" Griffin asked. Callum hesitated. "From before," he said. That word again. Before. Griffin shook his head slightly, not accepting it, but no longer able to dismiss it either. "You keep talking like I belong to a timeline I cannot access," he said quietly. Callum looked at him longer this time. "You do not belong to it," he said. "You are trapped in it." The words should have sounded dramatic, but Callum said them like a fact he had tested too many times to doubt. Griffin looked away, jaw tightening. "And you are what?" he asked. "The only thing that stays," Callum replied. They stood there for a moment in silence that did not feel empty anymore, only unfinished. Then Callum's phone vibrated again. He looked at it once, and for the first time, something like urgency crossed his expression. He turned the screen away. Immediately, but Griffin had already seen enough to recognize the word flashing before it disappeared. Deviation. Callum stepped slightly away, scanning the street again. Griffin noticed it this time more clearly, the way Callum positioned himself between Griffin and the open space around them, not controlling him, but containing the environment. "You should go back inside," Callum said. Griffin frowned. "We are not going back to that place," he said. Callum did not correct him. Instead, he nodded once and started walking, expecting Griffin to follow without forcing it. Griffin did, but not because he trusted him again, because leaving Callum alone in this moment felt more uncertain than staying near him. They reached a smaller building nearby, older, quieter, and Callum entered using a different key, one he did not explain. Inside, the lighting was dimmer, the space less sterile, more lived in, but still controlled. Griffin noticed immediately that this was not a new location. It had history. Callum closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a second longer than usual, like confirming they had not been followed. Griffin watched him. "You are exhausted," Griffin said. Callum did not deny it. That was the first honest thing he had not tried to justify. Griffin stepped closer without thinking, then stopped himself halfway, unsure whether proximity still meant safety or repetition. Callum noticed the movement, and, for a brief moment, their eyes met without barriers. Something unspoken passed between them there, not explanation, but recognition of shared weight. Callum reached into a cabinet and pulled out a small first aid kit, placing it on the table. Griffin frowned. "I am not injured," he said. Callum nodded. "Not now," he replied. That answer made Griffin pause again, because it suggested a continuity he could not see. Callum finally sat down, slowly, like the effort of remaining upright had limits. Griffin hesitated, then sat across from him instead of beside him, maintaining distance this time deliberately. Callum noticed, but did not comment. After a moment, Griffin spoke again. "When you said I always choose you," he said quietly, "what happens? If I stop?" Callum looked at him, and for the first time since everything began, there was no calculation in his expression, only something closer to weariness shaped by repetition. "Then I learn how to make you safe again," Callum said. Griffin's chest tightened at that, because it was not an answer about control. It was an answer about cost. Outside, somewhere distant, a faint electronic chime sounded from Callum's pocket, but he did not reach for it. Instead, he stayed still, letting it continue until it stopped on its own. And in that small refusal, Griffin began to understand that whatever Callum was protecting him from was not just coming again. It was already here, and Callum was the only thing standing in its way. Griffin woke up to silence that felt wrong, not because it was empty, but because it was missing something that had been there so consistently he had started to believe it was part of the air itself. The chair across from him was empty. The room Callum had brought him to the night before was still locked from the inside, still safe, still controlled, but Callum was gone. At first, Griffin thought it was temporary, that he had stepped out to check something or reset whatever system he had been watching so closely, but then he saw the table. The first thing missing was Callum's phone. The second was the key he always used to lock every space they entered. The third was the absence of any note explaining why. Griffin stood slowly, scanning the room, then the hallway, then the door. It was not forced open. Nothing suggested panic. Only intention. On the counter, however, was something left deliberately behind. A small envelope with Griffin's name written in Callum's handwriting. Not rushed. Not defensive. Final. Griffin opened it. Inside was a single page and a folded badge clipped to it. The page contained only a few lines. If you are reading this, the deviation cycle has escalated beyond containment. I am removing myself from proximity protocols. You will be safer without me nearby during active correction. Griffin read it twice before the meaning fully landed. Safer without me nearby. It was not protection in the way Griffin had started to understand it. It was removal, a choice made without consultation. A sacrifice that did not ask permission. He lowered the paper slowly, feeling something tighten in his chest that was not confusion anymore, but absence. He checked the badge next. It was official, clean, marked with institutional identification that did not belong to anything Griffin had seen before, but felt disturbingly structured. His name was not on it. Callum's was. Griffin walked out of the building without fully realizing he had decided to follow. The streets outside were louder now, more normal, which made everything feel more unreal. People passed him without noticing anything wrong, without knowing that something had just been removed from his life, without explanation or closure. He tried calling Callum's number once. It did not connect. A second time. Disconnected. By the third attempt, he already knew the result, but still tried anyway. Hours passed in a blur of movement without direction. Griffin returned to Callum's apartment instinctively, as if muscle memory still expected him to be there. The door was locked. The lock had been changed. A notice had been placed on the door from building management stating temporary vacancy due to compliance review. That phrase stopped Griffin longer than anything else. Compliance review. It did not belong in ordinary life. It belonged in systems that did not explain themselves. He stood there long enough that a neighbor eventually passed him, giving a cautious glance before continuing down the hall. Griffin finally stepped back, realizing with a slow heaviness that Callum had not just left him. He had been removed. That evening, Griffin received a message from an unknown sender. No number, just a secure notification that bypassed normal contact channels. The message was short. Subject: Griffin Hart scheduled for observational evaluation following anomaly report submission by Internal Protection Unit. Attendance required. Below it was a time, an address, and a classification tag Griffin did not recognize but instinctively understood as not optional. He stared at it for a long time, his hand still hovering over the screen as if waiting for a second message that would explain it away. There was none. What he did notice, however, was the attachment at the bottom of the message. A file preview, partially loaded, labeled with Callum Pierce's identification. Internal report. Authorization logs. Behavioral justification. Griffin did not open it yet. He could not. Not because he was afraid of information, but because part of him already understood what it would confirm. That Callum had not simply been protecting him in isolation. He had been reporting him, documenting him, and placing himself directly in the path of whatever system was now calling Griffin in for evaluation. And yet, beneath that realization, another truth pressed through more quietly, more painfully. Every time Callum had stepped between Griffin and something unknown, he had not been acting as a captor. He had been absorbing consequences meant for Griffin instead. Griffin looked at the address again. It was not far. It was central. It was official. And for the first time since everything began, Griffin understood that Callum had not disappeared by accident or abandonment. He had stepped away to make sure Griffin would arrive alone, and still protected. Griffin lowered the phone slowly, the unread file glowing faintly in his hand. As sirens passed far in the distance, and the notification timer began counting down toward an appointment he had not agreed to but somehow had already been prepared for long before he knew it existed. The building in the message had no name on the front, only a security checkpoint and a line of people who looked like they had already accepted whatever truth was about to be decided for them. Griffin stood at the back of that line, holding the secure notification in his hand like it weighed more than paper should ever weigh. The countdown on the message had already reached 0, but the doors had not opened for him yet. They were waiting for something or someone. When the doors finally unlocked, Griffin was guided through a narrow corridor into a large evaluation hall filled with glass panels, observers behind reinforced windows, and a central open space that felt less like a room and more like a controlled exposure site. Griffin stopped the moment he entered, because Callum was already there. Not seated, not restrained, standing in the center of the room with his hands visible and his posture steady, as if he had been waiting longer than anyone else in the building. Griffin's breath caught, not because of fear, but because of recognition mixed with exhaustion, like his body had been bracing for this exact moment even while believing Callum was gone. Across from Callum stood a panel of officials, silent and observing, one of them holding Griffin's file open on a tablet. Subject Griffin Hart is confirmed, one voice said. Evaluation for memory integrity deviation and unauthorized continuity interference is now active. Griffin did not understand all of it, but he understood enough. He stepped forward instinctively. Callum turned slightly, and for the first time since everything broke apart, there was no distance in his eyes. Only certainty. Do not speak yet, Callum said softly, just loud enough for Griffin to hear. Griffin ignored him. You left, Griffin said, voice tight. A flicker crossed Callum's face, not denial, not surprise, but acceptance. I had to, Callum said. The officials shifted slightly, as if that answer mattered more than Griffin realized. One of them raised a hand. Proceed with protocol verification. Before anything else could happen, Callum took a step forward. Not toward the officials, but toward Griffin. That movement alone changed the entire room. It was not approved distance. It was not protocol. It was choice. Callum stopped directly in front of Griffin, close enough that the separation between them felt like something deliberate, not imposed. I did not abandon you, Callum said. Griffin's jaw tightened. You erased yourself, he replied. Callum nodded once. So you would stop following me into resets, he said. The words landed differently here, in this space, under observation. Griffin felt something shift in the room, like a tension tightening around that statement. Explain, an official said. Callum did not look away from Griffin. Every reset requires removal of emotional anchor proximity, he said. If I remain close, he does not stabilize. If he does not stabilize, he does not survive long enough to reach the next cycle. Griffin's expression changed slowly, confusion breaking into something heavier. You are saying you leave me so I do not die, he said quietly. Callum nodded again. And I return so you can recognize me again, he said. A silence fell that was not procedural anymore. It was human. Griffin looked at him, really looked this time, not at the mystery, not at the system, but at the exhaustion behind Callum's control. And the messages, Griffin said, voice lower now. The surveillance, the reports, all of it. Callum did not hesitate. Evidence, he said, for when I am not believed. One of the officials stepped forward. Unauthorized persistence across cycles is a violation, they said. Callum finally turned slightly toward them, but only slightly. It is the only reason he is still here, he replied. That was when Griffin understood the weight of what Callum had been carrying alone. Not just memory, but repetition. Not just protection, but consequence. Griffin's voice dropped. How many times have I forgotten you? He asked. Callum did not answer immediately. When he did, it was quieter than anything he had said before. Enough that I stopped expecting gratitude, he said. Something in Griffin cracked open at that. Not anger this time. Something closer to grief. He stepped forward, closing the small distance Callum had left open, And for the first time, Callum did not retreat. Griffin reached out, stopping just before contact, hesitating only for a second before placing his hand on Callum's wrist. The same wrist he had seen marked, documented, restrained in ways Griffin now understood were not visible to him before. Callum closed his eyes briefly at the contact, not in relief, but in restraint finally allowed to soften. "Why keep doing it?" Griffin asked quietly. Callum opened his eyes. "Because every version of you still looks at me like I am someone worth remembering," he said. That answer did not resolve everything. It did not erase the system, or the evaluations, or the unknown cycles still hanging over them. But it changed something in the room. Griffin did not let go, and Callum did not step away. The officials exchanged glances, one of them lowering their tablets slightly, as if protocol had already begun shifting out of certainty and into reconsideration. A new document appeared on the screen behind them, labeled Continuation Authorization Pending Subject Alignment Confirmation. Callum noticed it first, but did not react with fear, only with readiness. Griffin followed his gaze. "What does that mean?" Griffin asked. Callum's hand finally moved, slowly turning so their fingers could align fully for the first time without hesitation. "It means this version of you gets to decide what comes next," he said. Griffin held his gaze, the weight of every forgotten version pressing into the present. For the first time, he did not pull away. And in that choice, the room around them stopped feeling like an evaluation and started feeling like a threshold towards something neither of them had been allowed to reach before, not until now. The evaluation hall was no longer silent, but it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Every screen, every observer behind the glass panels, every official in the room was focused on the space between Griffin Hart and Callum Pierce, as if the entire system had narrowed down to a single unresolved equation. Griffin still had his hand on Callum's wrist. He had not realized he was holding on that tightly until he felt Callum gently turn his hand so their fingers fully aligned, not resisting, not forcing, just accepting. It was the first time Callum had not tried to protect him by distance. An official stepped forward, voice steady but altered. "Continuation authorization is no longer pending. Subject alignment is stable." Another screen flickered. Files began to update in real time, collapsing years of reports into a single synchronized record. Griffin did not look at the screens. He was still looking at Callum. "Tell me everything," Griffin said quietly. Callum did not answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, like something inside him had finally stopped resisting collapse. "You were part of a recovery sequence project," Callum said. "A memory stabilization program designed to isolate repeated identity fractures caused by external system interference." Griffin's grip loosened slightly, not from letting go, but from realization pressing too fast. Callum continued, voice steady but lower now. "Each reset was meant to remove contamination points in your memory loop. I was assigned as your continuity anchor." Griffin shook his head once. "Anchor," he repeated. Callum nodded. "Someone who remains constant so you do not fully break between cycles." Silence spread through the room, but it was no longer judgmental silence. It was observation turning into understanding. Griffin finally pulled his hand back, not abruptly, but carefully, like he was testing whether reality would stay intact without contact. "So every time I forgot you," Griffin said slowly, "you stayed anyway." Callum's eyes did not move away. "Yes." Griffin's voice tightened. "Even when I did not recognize you." "Especially then," Callum said. Something in that answer shifted the entire emotional weight of everything Griffin had experienced. The empty apartment nights he could not remember. The feeling of déjà vu that never resolved. The strange sense of safety around a man he was supposed to have just met. None of it had been coincidence. An official voice interrupted. Project continuity breach resulted in unauthorized emotional attachment accumulation across cycles. The wording sounded clinical, but what it meant was simple. Callum had not only stayed. He had risked being erased with every return. Griffin turned slightly toward the glass panels, where rows of data were still updating. "And what happens to him now?" Griffin asked. The room hesitated. That hesitation answered more than words could. Callum finally stepped back half a pace, not from fear, but from decision. Griffin noticed immediately. "What are you doing?" Griffin asked. Callum did not look at the officials when he answered. He looked only at Griffin. "Ending the anchor designation," he said quietly. Griffin froze. No, he said immediately, sharper than before. Callum's expression softened slightly, not in relief, but in finality. It was never meant to be permanent, Callum said. Griffin shook his head. You are not leaving again, he said. This time Callum almost smiled, but it carried exhaustion rather than humor. I am not leaving, he corrected. I am choosing. An official began to protest, but the system behind them interrupted with a final update. Continuity subject deviation resolved. Anchor dependency dissolved. Memory stabilization complete. The words appeared on every screen at once. Callum had already stepped forward before the room could react. He reached into his pocket and placed a small device on the central console. Griffin recognized it immediately as one of the logs from before, the ones Callum had used to preserve continuity across resets. Callum pressed it once. The screen shifted. For the first time, the system showed not just data, but history. Every cycle, every reset, every moment Callum had stayed when he was not required to. Every time he had chosen proximity over protocol, even knowing it would cost him access to standard clearance. The room went quiet in a different way. Not confusion. Recognition. One official finally spoke, voice lower now. Unauthorized preservation of subject continuity outside protocol boundaries. Callum nodded once. Yes, he said. Griffin stepped forward again, this time without hesitation. Why? Griffin asked. Callum turned fully toward him. There was no system in his eyes now. No protocol. Only choice. Because you were never just a subject, Callum said. You were the only version of you that ever looked at me like I stayed because I wanted to. The silence that followed was complete. Griffin's breathing slowed, and for the first time since everything began, he was not trying to understand a system. He was trying to understand a person. And now, Griffin said softly. Callum did not hesitate. Now I stop leaving, he said. The officials did not intervene. The system had already stabilized beyond their control. The evaluation hall slowly shifted from observation to closure, screens dimming one by one as authorization dissolved into final confirmation. Griffin looked at Callum for a long moment, then reached out. This time there was no hesitation, no distance. He took Callum's hand fully, holding it like something real enough to remain. Then stay, Griffin said simply. Callum's grip tightened slightly, not protective now, but present. I am here, he said. And for the first time, it was not a promise made through cycles or systems or resets. It was a choice made in a single, irreversible moment. The screens behind them finally went dark. The hall opened to quiet daylight outside, and Griffin did not let go as they walked forward together, side by side, no longer anchored by repetition, but by the decision to remain in the same moment at the same time, finally allowed to continue forward into a future that no longer needed to be reset.